In early '43, Dr. Thomas had been at a scientific meeting where he met James Bryant Conant, or perhaps he'd known him before that. James Bryant Conant had been the president of Harvard University. They had a lot in common, and they left after that. Dr. Thomas came back here to Dayton because he and Dr. Hockwalt were co-owners of what was then Central Research for Monsanto. They were both co-directors at the time. Well, not too many months after that, namely in the latter part of the winter of '43, Dr. Thomas received a call from Dr. Conant asking him to come to Washington. So he went to Washington, and there he met with General Groves, who was the project director for the Manhattan Project, sworn to secrecy. Then he was told all about the atomic bomb project and what Monsanto could do. And the basic requirement in Dr. Thomas's case was to have Monsanto take over the chemistry and the development of being able to process polonium. The knowledge of the polonium chemistry at that time was next to nothing. Obviously, this is wartime, and anything that would help the American government win the war obviously was high on the priority of every American. Dr. Thomas accepted that assignment, and then they wanted Dr. Thomas, they meaning General Groves, wanted him to become a co-director of Los Alamos along with Dr. Oppenheimer. Dr. Thomas did not want to do that because he did not want to leave Monsanto. However, he did accept the assignment, the additional assignment of heading up the metallurgy and the chemistry of plutonium and polonium in conjunction with the University of Chicago and the University of California and Los Alamos. What happened with that part of the assignment for Dr. Thomas, I don't have any knowledge of that. But he did come back to Dayton, and they set up the initial research, if you will, at Central Research over on Nicholas Road in the city of Dayton. Two people were taken out of Monsanto's research department, and they began studying the chemistry of polonium. As I said earlier, the knowledge of polonium, its chemistry, was next to nothing, and that's where the work started. Yes, that was classified, and yes, they did have guards at the front door, but as far as things like health physics and worrying about radiation and all that, that wasn't in the cards. Well, for one thing, there wasn't that much to work with. Well, that was in early '43. Then they realized that they had to expand the operation, and that's when Monsanto took over the book repository for the city of Dayton over on First Street, or West First Street rather, and that had been built in the latter part of the 1890s or something like that as a seminary, and a bone break seminary. And then after that, when they built a new facility out in West Dayton, Northwest Dayton that is, the Department of Education took it over as a book repository. Well, Monsanto then took it over and began setting up laboratories in there. Now, there were a few problems. One of which was technical manpower was next to nothing by being able to hire people, that is. But they managed to get people, and that was a tough deal because you had to hire somebody, but you couldn't tell him what he was going to do. Because obviously this was pretty highly classified. But Dr. Thomas did get that rolling, along with Dr. Hockwalt. Well, now we get to the point where we need to produce polonium. Of course, we didn't have much by way of knowledge of production because the people at Los Alamos had worked on two processes. One was the lead oxide process, and the other was a bismuth process to get the alpha emitter polonium. The bismuth process won out, and then they decided, well, we can't do the production work at the Runnymede at Bone Break Seminary. So the Runnymede Playhouse was selected, and the reason that was selected is twofold. First of which, Dr. Thomas was married to one of the Talbot daughters. The Talbot family owned the Playhouse, And one thing led to another, and the building was taken over by the Corps of Engineers as under the guise of being work for the Signal Corps. The people, the residents of Oakwood were disturbed, and that's probably the understatement of the century. Because all of a sudden, over at Runnymede Playhouse, telephone poles are going up, fences are going up, spotlights are going up, and this is not the kind of thing that occurred in Oakwood. It being a very quiet community of about maybe 10,000 people at the time. Anyway, so Monsanto moved in and began setting up to process bismuth. As I said earlier, that process had been selected as the process for extracting polonium. Bismuth, backing up a little bit, bismuth slugs were initially irradiated down in Oak Ridge. Now, let me take that back. They were originally irradiated at Oak Ridge, and I believe somewhere around 1943, 44. In that neighborhood, the process was then transferred to Hanford, where the bismuth slugs were irradiated out there. Getting back to the community of Oakwood for the moment, all the what I call industrial activity, like bringing in the bismuth slugs in a big truck, because obviously since these things were irradiated, they were in lead casks for shielding. All this was done at night. Delivery of other materials, normal industrial supply, laboratory supply items were delivered by smaller trucks, so we didn't get the neighbors too upset. And but that didn't stop them being upset, by the way. Anyway, so the process was developed, and the production, if you will. You have to keep in mind, production of polonium was so small that you could probably put an entire half year's production in a thimble at the time. But we then produced the polonium. Early on, the polonium was shipped to Oak Ridge because the initiators were made out there. Later on, as Gus Essig pointed out, the process was transferred here. You were on that team, as I remember, Gus. And the initiator manufacturing, rather, was then at the Bone Break Seminary. Unit 3, Quonset hut was put up, an entire laboratory was set up so the initiators could be made there.
So then somebody I knew at Summit Court said, well, apply at Monsanto, and they were very close. Their Unit 3, one of the units of Monsanto, the one that was working on the atomic energy deal, they were very close to where I lived. I could walk. And I went there, and I liked the place from the first time I walked in the door. It was just different. And they gave me a typing test. I said I could type. Well, my typing was nil. It was awful. So they gave me a typing test, and they said, well, I was sorry, they didn't think they could use me. And I went home just crushed. And he called me, Dr. Lum, the head of the thing, called me and said, would I be interested in a lab job? Well, I was interested in any kind of a job, you know. So I said yes, and that's when I started on. And it was hush-hush work. We couldn't tell anybody what we were doing. But it was in the field of radioactivity, which I didn't. In my college physics textbook, there was one chapter on radioactivity at the end of the book. So this was a brand new field, really. A lot just wasn't known. I went into a lab immediately, and this developed into what we call the counting room. What we were doing were counting particles or X-rays that came off of radioactive material, and we had to determine the purity and the amount. And I developed techniques for doing this. There were not instruments available at the time, and we had an electronics department that developed our own instruments. And then my job was to find methods for analyzing materials. And we worked every day. Well, we didn't work Sundays. We worked 6 days a week regularly. And all holidays except Christmas. It was the only holiday we got off. First winter, we didn't have any heat in our lab, and it was pretty darn cold. Everybody had colds. Oh. And in the summer, all the windows were sealed shut, and no air conditioning. And it was just, and I complained about if there'd be, the way the floor plan was, if there'd be a fire out of there, there would have been no way we could have gotten out. And because we couldn't, the people next door had access to the outside. So their solution to the thing was to cut a hole about this big. We had one girl that was so heavy she'd have gotten stuck if she'd tried to get out that way. They cut the hole between the two labs. Unit 1, as we call it, one of the units of Monsanto in Dayton, was the central research facility. And there was no place for us to eat lunch at where I worked, which we called Unit 3. And so we piled in this station wagon, and you never knew whose lap you were going to be sit on. We were piled 3 or 4 high, it seemed to me. And that's how we got over to lunch every day. But you got to know people pretty well. Well, on Saturday, though, the Unit 1 wasn't, they didn't work on Saturday. So we did, some of the girls, all the girls were in on this. We decided to, on Saturdays, we would everybody bring something, and we'd have a lunch in the...
potluck type thing?
Yeah. So that went on fine until one day the girls that were bringing the food decided we'd have waffles. They brought waffle irons and everything, and of course the smell of the waffles wafted through the building. And he called me, and Dr. Lum called me in and said that since not much was known yet what the physical effects of this were, he thought it would be better if we didn't eat we should not eat in the laboratory. So we could have the station wagon to go to lunch wherever we wanted to. We had GIs working there, and they weren't allowed to tell. One of the boys, Will Conacher, got arrested for speeding or some traffic violation, and he was out of uniform, but they locked him up overnight until they could get in touch with somebody from could exonerate him. He's now given a building to Ohio University. Polonium was our main.
Polonium.
And that was used in the trigger for the bomb. I actually measured the material that went into the first bomb, the one that was dropped at Hiroshima, and also the one that was dropped at Nagasaki. We separated the polonium from bismuth, and that actual work of doing the separation was in that building in Oakwood. It was somebody's home, somebody's playhouse. I think it was the Talbot's playhouse, and they commandeered it. And the neighbors were really put out when Monsanto. It was a squash court that they'd had. It was a playhouse in Oakwood, and the government took it over for this work, and they separated. Polonium is what they did.
The initiator was the neutron source, which was a trigger, as it's called a trigger. It was also called an urchin. And when we needed a lot of neutrons, and that was a neutron source. That was machined out of beryllium. And that machining work was that done over at Unit 3, Gus? Yeah, it had to be.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it was done over at Unit 3. We only produced the polonium at Unit 4, Runnymede Playhouse. But that's the initiator, and it was imploded so that it was crushed, and then zillions of neutrons were generated by virtue of polonium being coated on the beryllium. Well, let me rephrase that. The beryllium was first coated with nickel. Is that right, guys?
Carbonyl.
Nickel carbonyl. Polonium was put on there. The nickel was a shield. And once the shield was broken, then you had, I don't know,
Contact.
trillions of neutrons, which incidentally no one knew was going to work back in early 43 by the scientists of Los Alamos.
You might, in retrospect, wonder why we were building neutron sources. When you set one of these gadgets off, it's only in what they call a supercritical condition for a very short time. And during that time, you got to throw the neutrons in there or it won't go off. And this is the whole idea of it, is that they implode this thing and it's supercritical, and then the neutrons go off, and that sets the thing off. So that's the reason for having the sources as a trigger, per se.
Arthur Compton came and talked to us, of all the technical people. The girls that worked for me in the accounting room weren't invited, but I was, and all the chemists and others. And but which was a small group at the time. I would say there were only about 25 of us. And Arthur Compton was one of the head men and one of the promoters of the nuclear research, or of the bomb, as it turned out. But we didn't even know what the people in the next lab were doing. It was so secret. And Arthur Compton told us, he said, what you're working on is in the way of a secret weapon. He said the Germans are working on it too, and whoever gets it first will win the war.
The one thing which you haven't asked me about, and I'd like to blow a horn for all the technical people that worked on the Manhattan Project. You have to keep in mind that in the summer of '42, the Los Alamos was selected as the site for Los Alamos. Decision was made by Dr. Oppenheimer and General Groves. That was in 1942, and the bomb went off 3 years later.
The polonium initiator was a very short-lived instrument. In it, polonium-210 had a half-life of 138 days, which meant in a year's time you went through three half-lives. So on a half-life you got 1/2, 1/4, 1/8 of the output after 1 year. So it was a remarkably good business for the mound to be in, because they didn't last that long. And that also spoke to the reason for the high degree of secrecy about mound and what it was all about. Very little was known, even within the complex, what went on at mound. They hardly knew we existed.
It's rather interesting that the test they made at Alamogordo was actually a plutonium test, not a uranium test. They figured the uranium bombs would work. Those are the ones they dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But the Alamogordo test in, August of 1945, was actually a plutonium test because they didn't know whether that was going to work.
A line about not knowing what we were doing. When a lot of the radioactive and the Manhattan Project work was declassified, Dayton's portion or part of that entire program did not get declassified until 1983. And therefore, until after that, no one ever even heard of Dr. Thomas, and he played a major role in the Manhattan Project. But because of classification problem, he was never really recognized for his contribution, and that's why Mon Lab didn't get much notoriety.
The bomb was dropped. We were still in our location in Dayton because somebody came. We were standing in the cafeteria line, and somebody came in with a newspaper with the headlines, "Atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima," or words to that effect. This was when people were beginning to feel guilty about having dropped the bomb. But I never felt guilty about that because, first place, I had two brothers in the service and and my husband and Tinka's husband, and the fact that the war ended, that ended the war. There was, and thousands of lives were saved on both sides who would have died if we had had to invade Japan. And so I think we saved lives. And then afterwards, for a long time, we're the only ones that had the bomb, and we didn't use it for aggressive purposes. The only time it was used was to end that war, which was not of our making to start with.